On the 6th of June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy known as D-Day began. But in the heroic landings on the beaches, there were scores of execution that was carried out on both sides. Some Allied soldiers, after the war had come to an end, admitted that they were not in the business of taking prisoners, and they shot German soldiers who had their arms up in surrender when they should have been captured. But there were also executions and war crimes carried out by the Germans as the Allies advanced and pushed the German army back. Dozens of Canadian soldiers were executed in the headquarters of German commanders in what was known as the Normandy massacres, and many of these atrocities have been forgotten. But there was a war crime involving 8 American paratroopers who were executed and killed shortly after they landed in France. But what is the story of the executions of the D-Day American paratroopers who were executed by the Germans? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Around 11 p.m. on the 5th of June 1944, a C-47 took off from an airfield in Lincolnshire in England. It was one of dozens of C-47 aircraft that were taking part in the airborne invasion of D-Day. The aircraft following takeoff flew in formation across the south of England, and then they travelled in darkness over the English Channel. The mission that the men of the aircraft had been given was to navigate to Normandy and to drop 15 paratroopers over a drop zone designated as T, which was a 3-mile stretch of flat ground northeast of the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. However, as the aircraft went across the English Channel, they did not know that the paratroopers of the aircraft 4292382 would be dropped in the wrong place. At 2 a.m. the aircraft managed to avoid anti-aircraft fire near to Guernsey and Alderney before they crossed over the Normandy coastline. But the aircraft then hit dense fog, and when they needed to see them most, the pilots could not. Believing they were near the target, the specific aircraft mentioned pushed into more cloud and it drifted off course. But the men on board were then told to stand up, hook up, and then do a last-minute equipment check. One paratrooper, Private Bolsh, accidentally opened his reserve parachute inside the aircraft and he could not jump. But at 2:44 a.m, Lieutenant Robert Schutt led 13 other paratroopers out of the C-47, through the jump door and into enemy territory. When the men descended, they came down around 4 miles to the northwest in a field near to the village of Hemevez. Lieutenant Schutt realised what had happened when they hit the ground, and instead of linking up with hundreds of paratroopers, they were on their own. There were 2 men, Corporal Fred G. Wandell and Private Robert G. Watson, who were injured when they landed, and Wandell had landed in a tree and then fallen from this, and he broke his pelvis. He was crying in agony, which was not ideal as the men were in German-occupied land. 2 soldiers administered morphine as they were then moved to a nearby small coppice, which was enough for the men to get cover. There were 12 of the 14 men who jumped that were there, and they were then ordered to spread out along the tree line to avoid being captured by the enemy in one go. 3 men were ordered to go on patrol to find out their location, and in the distance was a farmhouse, and the men were told to go there and ask for direction. The patrol then left and crossed the field. They knocked at the door of the farmhouse, and a woman named as Madame Brisset then told the Americans that the German headquarters was around a kilometre away. She told the Americans that there were regular patrols that did pass through the area, saying they would be in trouble if they stayed where they were. But as this happened, the American soldiers heard German soldiers approaching. The women in the house then told the 3 Americans to go into the barn, where they hid out, as a German 12-man patrol then passed close to the hedgerow near the woods. The Americans in the forest moved to a creek to hide out, and the Germans then came into the wood, and they then stumbled upon the injured Corporal Wandell. They asked him questions and pointed their guns at him. They wanted to know who else was with him, believing it was very unlikely that a paratrooper had entered enemy lines himself. As this happened, Lieutenant Hutt ordered the Americans to fire, and there was an exchange of gunfire between the 2. Grenades were thrown, and one exploded near to Wandell, but within a few minutes the Germans, who knew the area, had outflanked the Americans and had defeated 3 of the men in hand-to-hand fighting. An attacking German soldier hit one American with his rifle and knocked him down, before he then crushed his skull with the rifle butt, killing Private Robert Watson. The same happened to Private First Class Daniel B. Ullman, who was repeatedly struck in the skull, and a 3rd man, Private Andrew Kling, was shot in the heart and was bayoneted in the chest, before he was hit many times in the head, crushing his skull. It showed the Americans how brutal the German enemy was, but the 3 men who had been left inside the barn rushed to see what was happening. They could see the Germans searching 4 of their men, and they had their helmets off and their gear taken from them. They considered firing at the Germans, but worried about friendly fire, but they could see at this point that they were then told to turn right on the road to Le Castel. One French eyewitness would confirm that following this, the American soldiers were then marched through a gate and taken to a field near to the area of woodland where the firefight had taken place a short time before. But at around 8 AM on the 6th of June 1944, as the D-Day invasions were underway, the French eyewitness, who was at the time chopping wood at his home, would then hear gunshots coming from the forest. It's not known specifically why the German soldiers executed the 4 Americans, but Private Robert E. Werner, Private Delamar C. McElhenney, Private Anthony J. Hitzthaler, and Private First Class M. Heck were taken back to the place where they were captured. They were then shot in the back of the head. The executioners who did this wanted to make it seem that the Americans had been killed in a firefight, but they had of course all become prisoners of war. A resident of nearby Hemavez that afternoon would go into the wood to fetch some supplies for his fire, and he would come across the bodies of the 4 dead American paratroopers. He then reported this to the authorities, and further men went to investigate what had happened. The mayor's assistant of Hemavez was then ordered by the Germans to bury the bodies of the Americans. They did this in a cemetery in the village's church, and a number of French men were gathered to dig a common grave for the Americans. But the French recovered the bodies of 7 victims, including those who had been battered by rifle butts during the firefight. A priest, as the men were buried into the grave, gave the blessing, and the Americans had their dog tags on them still, and one of these was left on the body for identification, whilst the mayor kept the other as safekeeping. The personal belongings of these men were also kept, but at 6 PM the men were buried and were given a short funeral service. But they then found another dead American paratrooper, and this was the remains of Private John Katona, who had been killed in combat against the Germans. As the mass grave was sealed, he was given his own burial alone nearby. But within the next 10 days the Americans would fight back, and on the 17th of June 1944, the American forces liberated the village of Hemavez from the Germans. When this happened, the dog tags were handed over to the US soldiers, and then the Americans were told of the executions that had taken place. They were also shown the graves of the men, and the Americans recovered the bodies from the grave. One by one the bodies were exhumed and placed on stretchers where they were examined, and the wounds were recorded closely. For example, one of the men who was shot was documented as being shot in the right cheek by a bullet that made a large exit wound on his forehead, whilst Private Hitzthaler was shot in the back of the neck. One of the wounds sustained by one of the privates was so awful that the French placed a handkerchief over his head when they moved him. What shocked the Americans was what happened to Private Kling's body, with the several wounds he had sustained, including the bayonet wound to the heart. But following this, the men were reburied in a local US military cemetery. However, Corporal Fred Wandel, who had broken his pelvis during the jump, had been recovering, and the Germans had taken him to a hospital in Cherbourg. He was interviewed about what he saw, and he said the Germans, for him, had been rather considerate. He did not recall any mistreatment he saw, but when he was told of the evil that occurred against his fellow soldiers, he was shocked. But what of the 3 men that had been sent on the patrol to the French farmhouse? These 3 men managed to survive the Normandy campaign and would testify as witnesses at the inquest. A final report on the killings took place, and the court found that the Germans had violated the Geneva Convention and that it was murder. The only man who was identified was Major Felix, who could not be explicitly linked to the ordering of the executions, so the matter was closed, and little reprisal took place. The bodies of the men would be repatriated to a permanent US military cemetery again near to Omaha Beach, but some of them were repatriated back to America, but others remained in France. A sign on the cattle gate that leads to the woods today commemorates those paratroopers who were executed following their capture after they landed in the incorrect spot. The incident showed the brutality of the German soldiers, as some paratroopers were battered to death when they should have been taken as prisoners of war. It is an incident which is not the most well known, but it certainly deserves to be documented, as it was a shocking series of executions that saw these men become some of the first victims of D-Day. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.